All right, let's talk a little bit about behavioral theory or learning theory. Okay, a couple of things by way of introduction. Behaviorism really got its start in the 50s, largely as a reaction against psychodynamic theory. Freud's approach was really all that was out there prior to that, and many people became dissatisfied with his approach. They didn't like the fact that so much was going on that couldn't be measured or seen. There were all these made-up terms and things that were going on in people's heads. They didn't like that there was all this focus on the past and what happened in early childhood. And about the same time, there was a growing appreciation or even infatuation with the scientific method, and this idea that, boy, with the scientific method, we can figure out just about anything. And maybe we should apply that to human behavior. So the idea kind of became, maybe we need to not pay attention to all this stuff that we can't see that Freud talks about, but really focus on what we can see and how we can change things. And so there became kind of a shift away from personality theory or understanding how people develop a personality to merely just learning theory. How is it that people learn specific behaviors, and how can we use what we know about learning to help people make changes in their life to behave in the ways that they want and that others around them expect? All right, to understand the roots of learning theory, we need to go back a little ways. That's Ivan Pavlov there, who was a Russian scientist. He was a physician, and during the late 1800s was doing some research and had what I like to call a digestive accident. Now, you and I have probably all had digestive accidents, but his was a little different. He was studying digestive reflexes, essentially salivation using animals, and his work was groundbreaking enough and important enough that in 1904 he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology. And during his acceptance speech, he said something that really caught people's attention. He talked about conditioned reflexive responses. And turns out that that's what ended up being his major contribution to the world of science, at least the one that he's most remembered for. Here's what Pavlov meant by a conditioned reflexive response. There in box 1, we know that when you present food to an animal, it salivates. That's just a reflexive response. And when you blow a whistle, like in box 2, nothing happens. There's no reflex there. Now in box 3, this is the key. When you pair those two things together, the natural reflexive stimulus and the unnatural one, or the neutral one, over time, the dog will begin to associate those two things together, so that, as you see in box 4, eventually just blowing the whistle will create the response. So the response is not natural. A whistle doesn't lead to salivation, but you've conditioned it by associating them together over time. Now, a human example that we might see in counseling, there's nothing about seeing a bar that would make you crave alcohol. However, if you've gone into the bar enough and drunk enough there, eventually you'll begin to associate just seeing a bar with a craving for alcohol. It becomes a conditioned response. So this becomes the basis then of what we know today as classical conditioning, where we pair a natural stimulus with an unnatural one, and when they're paired together over time, that unnatural stimulus will then be able to produce that same response. Then becomes called a conditioned response. So playing with all that stimulus and response stuff in order to create or modify behavior. Fast forward then to the 1950s and 1960s, and we meet the person who's most frequently associated with the behaviorist approach, B.F. Skinner. He was also working with animals and trying to change their behavior, get them to do what he wanted. He put rats in little boxes that had levers that you could push to get food, and there were lights and sounds. They eventually became called Skinner boxes because he was famous for his experiments in these. And through all of this, he discovered what he called operant conditioning. And the main idea in operant conditioning is that what comes after a behavior will influence whether that behavior gets repeated or not. So you can see there that there's a behavior, and that behavior then has consequences, and those consequences influence whether the behavior happens again. So some things about consequences. Anything that increases a behavior will be called a reinforcement, and things that decrease behavior are called punishments. Now you can either apply something or take something away as you try to change a behavior. If you apply something, it's considered a positive or an additive punishment or reinforcement. And when you take something away, you're subtracting. So when you see a plus and a minus, it's not about good or bad. Don't think positive and negative that way. Think about adding or subtracting. So you can either add something or subtract something, and when you do that, it will either increase or decrease a behavior. So in looking at all the different combinations of things, adding, subtracting, punishing, reinforcing, Skinner discovered that the thing that works the very best is when you have an intermittent additive reinforcement. Intermittent means that you don't get the reinforcement every single time after the behavior. It's variable, you don't know. But that increases the likelihood that you'll keep trying to get that reinforcement added to you. In the 1960s, another social psychologist made an impact on what we know about learning and ultimately on the behaviorist approach to counseling. This was Albert Bandura. And through a variety of observations and experiments, he realized that not only do the things that come before behavior and that follow behavior impact learning, but also there were some characteristics about the individual that made a difference. Now, this was a little controversial because most of the behaviors had tried to avoid anything that couldn't be measured and seen, overt outside external behavior. But Bandura was saying that people learn also just from observing other people. So there's something going on cognitively that can impact learning. He thought that there were personal factors in addition to environmental factors that impacted learning. These were things like how much a person was paying attention and the people that they were observing. Was this someone that the individual looked up to? Did they find this person important, powerful, attractive? All those factors impacted whether a person learned. His famous experiment was with the Bobo doll, where a group of children were just playing quietly, and then an adult came in who was seen to have some power and would then kind of behave aggressively toward the Bobo doll and then leave. And after that, the children started playing aggressively themselves. So the idea is that we can learn how to behave just by observing other people do some things. So the impact of that observation, like I've said, goes up when the models, the people that we are observing, are somehow desirable to us, when we see them as attractive, as similar, powerful. That increases the impact of their behavior on our own behavior. All right, so let's think a little bit about the roots of client concerns as well as the resolution of client concerns from a behaviorist standpoint. Behaviorists believe that behavior is caused either by what comes before it, classical conditioning. Sometimes we talk about the antecedents of behavior. Also is influenced by what comes after the behavior or the consequences, and that's operant conditioning. And we know as well that the social environment also impacts behavior, according to social learning theory. So those things are the roots of behaviors, and client concerns involve behavior, so the roots of client concerns are those things. Now, that also means that the resolution or changes to behaviors come from changing the antecedents, the consequences, and the social environment in which a behavior occurs. And I think the people who understand these behaviorist principles really, really well are the folks who have spent millions of dollars trying to figure out how to get us to spend a lot of money when we go to a casino. So the folks in Vegas do all sorts of things in terms of how often we're reinforced, as in terms of the cues think of the bells and the flashing lights that indicate that someone is about to win and how they impact a person's behavior, thinking of just the slot machines, as well as the social environment, the kinds of people that are there, the way that they're behaving, the fun that they're having, all influence a person to want to spend a lot of money in the casinos. All right, let's talk a little bit about assessment, because assessment is hugely important really in any theory, but it plays a really dominant role in behaviorist counseling. Sometimes the behaviorist approach is called a functional assessment, functional behavioral assessment, or applied behavioral analysis. And really, if what we're going to do is change people's behavior, then we really need to understand in a lot of detail what might be the things that are causing and maintaining behavior. So we'll get a lot of detail about when and where and what's happening before, the antecedents, what happens after, the consequences, the context of the behavior, what triggers there might be in the environment, the social environment, who that this person knows might be behaving in a similar way, and when this behavior is not occurring. So lots and lots of detail about the things around the behavior that we know impact behavior. There'll be real careful tracking of these sorts of things over time. Certainly you do this in some conversation with the client, but you have the client then go out and start paying really careful attention. What happened right before you took that drink? What happens after you smoke? What happens after you have an argument with your spouse? So all of that kind of thing to understand what's going on. Now, another dimension here that's really important to understand is an item called secondary gain. And this is the idea that when people continue to behave in ways that are troubling or distressing to them, there must be something that's reinforcing that behavior. That hidden kind of reinforcement of problematic behavior is called a secondary gain. The client, even though they're distressed by it, they're getting something out of this. Something is reinforcing that behavior. So trying to identify what might be that secondary gain. The classic example there is the child who acts out and then gets punished, but continues to act out because it's getting them some attention. That attention is a secondary gain. Even though the behavior leads to problems, there's that attention that actually is overriding the problems and leads to the behavior being repeated. And then finally, we need to understand in a lot of detail, what does this client find rewarding? What are the features of models that they might find attractive? What are the natural consequences that they find appealing that we could then use to help the client change behavior? So a lot of really detailed assessment. Okay, another couple of things about behaviorist counseling is that the goal setting is really important. Now, we could probably say in general that goals are important to most counseling approaches, but the behaviorist approach really takes a lot of time to carefully craft very specific and measurable goals. Remember that the behaviorists love to be able to quantify, to measure, to be precise about it. Their approach probably lends itself really well to doing this, and it's been adopted by a lot of agencies require very precise behavioral goals. Insurance companies require this kind of behavioral goal. So even if you're not using a behaviorist approach, it can be really helpful to learn how to do goals in the way that the behaviorists do. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in class. So just remember that goals are very important and they are very precise. Another thing to note about the behaviorist approach is that the counselor tends to be a little bit more directive than in other approaches. The counselor is seen as the expert on behavior and on what causes and maintains behavior, and so they tend to be a little more in a position of authority and use that authority to help clients change their behavior. They'll often give clients homework. In fact, it would be hard to be a good behaviorist counselor and not give pretty regular, very specific homework, either to track behaviors and learn about what's maintaining them, or to change the antecedents and consequences in order to change behavior. One of the goals kind of overall in the behaviorist approach, they would love to be able to get counseling down to a very specific science, so that there could be a manual that says, here's how you help someone who's dealing with depression. Very step-by-step, precise, Again, think about the scientific method that this approach grew out of, and the love of being able to quantify, count, measure, observe everything that goes on. So what then do behaviorist counselors do to try and help clients resolve their concerns? We talked a little bit about the importance of assessment and goal setting, and sometimes just those processes help clients make changes in their lives and begin to resolve their concerns. But there are a number of specific techniques that the behaviorists use, largely through tweaking the antecedents and the consequences and the social context of behavior to help people resolve their concerns. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail about these, so if you have questions about them, make sure to note them and let's talk about them in class. But each of them is using those change principles based on learning theory to help people adjust their behavior. Some of the most common ones are the systematic desensitization for dealing with fears, identifying something that a person is afraid of, and then helping them learn relaxation techniques that they can employ as they approach that fearful object or event. Token economies, hugely common in schools and even in the criminal justice system, where there's a points system to reward people for the desired behavior. Aversion therapy, also using a behaviorist principle, the common example is antabuse. You take this pill so that then when I behave in a way that I'm trying to change, when I have a drink, I get violently ill. So that positive punishment will reduce the likelihood that I'll drink again. Talked about skills training. We can help people learn specific skills using behaviorist principles, lots of modeling, role-playing, participation in groups. So all of those things are techniques that behaviorists use. So where do we see behaviorist counseling principles at work? Really, the behaviorists employ their ideas and their techniques in a variety of settings, and they've become so common that they're used in a lot of settings where it's not even counselors that are employing them. So some of the main ones that I've mentioned before include working with anxiety and fears, in the education system to manage classroom behavior. The same ideas used in the criminal justice system, in prisons and jails, for managing people's behaviors. Really common in the substance use arena. And then finally, you see them used a lot with children who are dealing with the struggles of autism. Behaviorist principles are really common in all of these areas. Now, you find them in a variety of other places, but these are some of the most common. All right, a quick review here. As far as the way of thinking in behaviorist counseling, it's all based on the learning theory we talked about. The idea that what causes client concerns as well as what resolves them has to do with the antecedents, the consequences, and the social context of behaviors. The things that come before, the things that come after, and the social environment is both what causes certain behaviors, and tweaking those things is what will change behaviors. As far as a way of being, we mentioned that the behaviorists tend to be a bit more expert or top-down, and a little more directive, although they still aim to be collaborative and really work with clients in identifying behaviors and identifying the strategies to change behaviors. Finally, the way of doing is very active. There's a lot of in-session and at-home change that will tweak those antecedents, consequences, in the social context. Finally, I want to mention some concerns about the behaviorist approach to counseling. The first is that to do it very well is harder than it sometimes seems. The concepts are simple and straightforward, but doing it well requires a lot of precision, a lot of time, a lot of good knowledge of learning theory. It requires some control over the circumstances of a person's life in order to change those antecedents, consequences, and the social context. The next one is more a criticism of the field at large. Because it's based on the scientific method, the behaviorist approach is easier to research than many others. And the research shows that it's effective in many cases. But because of that, many insurance companies and agencies have decided that it should be used with everything. So it gets applied more broadly than I think it should be. Next, I think there are some unintended consequences that can come from the behaviorist approach, particularly if it's not done well. The first of these is that when we reward people for behavior, we can unintentionally reduce their internal or intrinsic motivation for doing something. My example of this is that my kids used to bring home coupons for Pizza Hut if they would do a certain amount of reading when they were in school. And we would just put them aside and then throw them away. We didn't want our kids to read because they could get pizza. We wanted them to read because they enjoyed reading, because it was a fun experience. Related, rewards can be overvalued by clients. Whatever we put as the reward for a behavior becomes suddenly very important. My daughter is nannying for some kids whose parents use video games as a reward. And unintentionally, what they're communicating to those kids is that video games are somehow very desirable and that we ought to do whatever we can to obtain more time to play video games. And I don't think that's what the parents wanted to have happen. Really, we could ask ourselves, what's being learned? Are we learning something deep inside, or are we just learning to react to the rewards and the consequences of our behavior? People can be trained to behave altruistically, but are they really behaving in an empathic way, or are they just responding to rewards and consequences? And then finally, we'll talk about this one in your second year. People who have experienced complex trauma don't respond very well to the kinds of token economies and contingent behavior plans that are often used to try and help them. So be aware that there are some concerns with this approach. It can do a lot of good for a number of people, but it's definitely not perfect, like any other approach, and we need to be aware of some of these concerns. All right, that's it. Thanks.